Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. In the spring of 1985, the New York Museum of Modern Art launched an exhibition called An International Survey of Recent Painting and Sculpture. This exhibition claimed to survey that era's most important painters and sculptors from 17 countries. And on the roster of 165 artists, there were only 13 women. The proportion of artists of color was even smaller. One account puts the number at 8 among 165. None of those artists of color were women. The Women's Caucus for the Arts led a protest across the street from MoMA, calling on people to boycott the exhibit. But their picketing was ignored, leading 7 women to form a group that wanted to take more radical action to bring gender equity to the art world. They called themselves the Guerrilla Girls, spelled Guerrilla, from the Spanish word guerra, meaning war. But their members also embrace the way the word sounds in English, and they wear gorilla masks when conducting their demonstrations. Periodically, the Guerrilla Girls conduct weenie and banana counts, wherein members visited institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and counted nudes, noting the ratio of male to female subjects, as well as the ratio of male to female artists represented in the various collections. For example, data gathered from their survey in the Met in 1989 showed that women artists had produced less than 5% of the works in the modern art galleries, while 85% of the nudes were female. Today, we're going to talk about patriarchy in the art world, drawing a long line before the Guerrilla Girls and going right up until the present day. And to guide us on this fascinating and rather infuriating trajectory, I am joined by art historian Sunday Rennie. Welcome, Sunday.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have this conversation. I'll introduce our friendship by saying that we met in Paris a year ago in art museums.
Yes.
And you were such just a fabulous guide, kind of like a world-changing guide for my daughter and myself. And so it's been, so wonderful to be in touch since then. And I'm really excited to have our listeners learn from your expertise today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm very happy to be here. And especially happy to discuss the issue of gender imbalance within the art market, art world in general. So
I'm very excited to get to it. But before we do that, I wonder if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, kind of the factors in your origins that brought you to do the work that you do today.
Well, so I've got a kind of an interesting, I was suddenly born into the arts, one could say, because I was actually named Sunday after a very famous arts patron named Sunday Reed in Australia. And my grandmother, who happened to be an artist, 20th century artist within kind of the Australian modern art canon, she named me after Sunday Reed because she wanted me to be named after, an intelligent woman that happened to be very heavily involved in the arts. So I wasn't named after the day. I was named after this woman, and very proudly so. So my grandmother, Joy Peck, my mother were both artists. It's a bit of a tragic story in a way, but it's also kind of she died for her passion. My grandmother, who was actually the first artist, Australian artist at least, to be invited to a little ceramics kind of based town here in France called Limoges. She would unfortunately die of esophagus cancer because of the inhalation of the fumes due to her enamel painting. And, on her deathbed, I know it's a little bit kind of a tragedy, but on her deathbed, she was like, Sunday, what are you going to do when you grow up? Or, I was in my early 20s when this occurred. And I essentially said, don't worry, Joy, I'm going to become, an art curator rather than an actual artist. So I happened to be studying my bachelor's in fine arts at the time, but I, was very proud. I was like, you don't need to worry about me. I'll be within the museum institutions. And, I think she realized the difficulty of being in the arts, and so she didn't want to pass it on. But I said, well, you kind of started that off by naming me Sunday. So I would go on to, funnily enough, do my honors thesis in internet art. So I was looking at the time, which was, quite a new idea way back when, of looking at how internet artists were criticizing knowledge, and the status of society, through knowledge, through the internet. So that was quite an interesting time. I guess it's kind of dwindled down to that connection to fake news.
Mm-hmm.
But I would then go on to complete my master's in art curating. And after I finished that, I moved straight to Paris. So it was kind of I needed to get to Paris essentially. So since then, I've been working in institutions. I have worked for interior designers as well as for collectors, building up collections. And today I find myself more in the private guiding world. So very happily working on my own business and everything within private tours of Paris.
Fabulous. Okay, thanks for that introduction. I'm wondering too, when you started kind of becoming aware of gender issues, aware of patriarchy, either in your life or in the art world, or both.
Sorry to laugh, but I think since ever, since forever. I mean, uh, I think it's always been quite evidenced, but within female artists, I suppose, even I've worked with certain universities doing guest lectures and everything, and I think, as far as I can remember, I've recognized the injustices. Not maybe injustice is too strong a word, or maybe it's not, but certainly the imbalance within representation of female artists, but more and more and more, especially because I actually work a lot, at the Musée d'Orsay, at the Louvre, and so on. And a lot of the time, specifically at the Louvre, which is an institution that represents a large portion of art, everything from antiquity to 1848. I very, very, very rarely get the opportunity to show a female artist within that time frame.
Wow.
Then I jump to the Orsay, the Musée d'Orsay, and I have it's a much smaller frame of time, and yet I typically only get to show one, maybe two female artists. And then again, at the Pompidou Center, which is, the kind of third bracket of the main French institutions here, maybe one artist. And it's not to say that there's not female artists within that, but it's just that typically the representation is more geared, and even the curation of these institutions is more geared to male artists. And I guess we'll flesh out maybe why.
Yeah, so that is so interesting to me too, that, going to all those major museums all over the world, really, you really are only seeing men. And that brings up the question for me, and I think we'll get to this later in the episode, but why? Why? Is it because women artists throughout the ages weren't creating art because they were too busy raising families, they weren't allowed to go to art school? Is
Right.
it that they were creating art but the male buyers weren't buying it, they weren't exhibiting it? So I'm just wondering, what are some of the high level issues that create the situation where there just aren't women in the museums that you're
So
teaching in?
I think that there's a multitude of answers that we can come to in regards to that, and, hypotheses as well.
Mhm.
Um, in the case of certain artists, certain female artists have actually been quite successful during their careers. Artemisia Gentileschi being one of them, who we'll probably flesh out a little bit in a moment. But it just so happens that, I think it's that adage of, history is written by the winners. Often it tends to be this kind of overlooked, the female artist or the female artists can often be written out of history. And again, I've got some examples to discuss about that. Writers, art historians tended to be male up until a certain time. Fine arts academies tended not to actually accept women. And yes, a woman's place tended to be, in the kitchen or, with her children. So even when there was the talent, either there was an exceptional amount of talent that kind of surpassed that expectation or that reservation of women's, roles as being in the kitchen or being, the child bearer. And I suppose otherwise, there was this kind of, well, you may be good, but you're not that good, or this kind of attitude. And then you can even go a step further and say that the majority of curators tended to be male, up until, maybe I just said that, but the majority of curators as well as art historians tended to be male, and also art dealers, and also art collectors even. You could go that far. So I suppose that's maybe a kind of overarching reason for the lack of female artists, not lack of female artists, but lack of presentation or representation of female artists.
That makes sense, that it seems like at every level of the structure, it was controlled by men, and it still is in some ways. And we'll get to that. But maybe we can shift gears now and have you talk about some of the artists that did have success and really were world-class artists. Maybe talk about who they were, what their contributions were, and maybe some of the challenges that they faced.
Right. So remembering that I'm Paris based, so a lot of my my artists that I would like to discuss are European artists, and not to neglect, or not to neglect the fact that there are a multitude of female artists out there, and even my perspective, coming from a white Western female perspective, is certainly something to take into account for. So that being said, one of the artists that I'd just like to touch on, or there's several artists, female artists, that I'd like to touch on. One is a female impressionist artist named Berta Morisot. And so actually she was, born around the same time as Monet, as an example. And she was very fortunate to have, she and her sister were both very fortunate to have parents that were very understanding of these artists, of her talents, let's say. And so they would actually allow for, private tutoring. So she was trained in a kind of academic sense. And then one day she was, at the Louvre, and she would meet Manet. And, whilst copying a Velasquez painting at the Louvre, they would set up, this kind of muse model lover relationship. Now, for whatever reason, Berta would go on to marry Edouard Manet's brother, Edgar.
Oh.
Yes. And so we don't know whether maybe it was something arranged between the two. But essentially, Edgar, the kind of lesser known Manet, would actually be very supportive of Berta. So they would have a child together, Julie Manet. And through that kind of the ties that she made with the Manets, she would meet a bunch of the Impressionists. And so she would actually participate in between 1874 and 1886. She would participate in 7 out of the 8, Impressionist salons. And
Wow.
yet there's various reasons for the fact that she goes unnoticed today. And so I'm making a real effort when I'm showing people around the Musée d'Orsay to show off her work, because she's actually a real talent. It's not just because she's a female artist that I'm trying to show off her work. It's just incredible to see her brushwork, her expression through color, and then to think that indeed her name is far less known than, Monet, Sisley, Pissarro, and so on, very simply because she is a female artist. And to trace it back to the origins, it's actually, despite her having partaken and despite her being very, relatively highly regarded amongst her peers, the catalog writer of the Impressionist salons decided, she's a woman, therefore I'm going to omit her name.
Wow.
So that's like the beginning of the reason that Berta's Morisot is not really well known. Her name is not well known today. And so I think it's only now that things are starting to change. And as an example, 2018, the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia was the first to have a retrospective on her work. And so now, so now we're seeing a shift. Like I'm noticing personally, having worked in, the museums for at least 9 years now, I'm noticing personally an increase in the Morisots that are on display. It was like, one or two. Now I'm seeing 5 or 6 on display. And so that, the exposure is a big thing, to consider as well when it comes to women or female artists.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. I
Yeah.
have to say, one thing I thought of just now is just kind of something that gives me hope and it really optimistic is that can change. To your point of like you're seeing more and more exhibitions of her work, it reminds me that can change from one generation to the next. For example, I don't have this experience in the arts, but in literature, I had never heard the name Mary Wollstonecraft until I was probably in my 30s. And my daughters learned about her like in elementary school. And so once it catches on and somebody learns about a person's work and then they start talking about it, if they start talking about it to children, those children grow up with
Right.
those people kind of populating the pantheon of great writers or great artists or scientists or whatever, and they grow up just thinking it's normal. So it can change. It can,
Completely. Yes.
yeah.
And I would actually say that I personally feel like it is changing amongst younger generations, but also
Mm.
amongst institutions only now.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even since since the Gorilla Girls, with that data that I shared at the beginning too, it's changed a ton since then. It seems like, or
Definitely.
no?
I feel like it's on the art market specifically. I know we're going to come to that later, but
Okay.
specifically on the art market, I'm seeing changes now.
Okay. Oh, good.
And also within curation as well.
Good.
Yeah. Finally.
Finally. Okay. Well, yes, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But tell us more stories. I loved the story of Bertha Morris. So tell us about some other women that you love teaching about.
So that's Morris. So I really love her story. I think she was a true talent. Unfortunately, she would die of tuberculosis, as with her husband. So I guess also I need to double check, but I'm pretty sure that she lived until only her 50s, and so that could be a reasoning for it as well. Another artist would be Mary Lansin, another French artist. Lansin, she's a great artist to know. In fact, I have to say that I like components of her work, but she's not my favorite artist. But something that I've noticed within the museum space is, again, an effort to curate or to show. Recently at the Orangerie, another museum in Paris, to show some of the lesser known artists of their collection. Their collection is actually a really fascinating collection in its own, but that's for another time, just how they actually obtain the collection. But typically it's noted for holding works by uh, Renoir, a great Cezanne collection, some beautiful Modiglianis. And then at present, the Cezannes and the Renoirs are off in, I believe, in Milan for just they've lent them out. So the curators have started to show off Marion Laurencin as well as Haïm Soutin's works. So Laurencin being the artist that I want to focus on. And so a lot of it's, again, really a pleasure to be able to show these works to my clients, because a lot of them haven't heard of either of these artists. And Haïm Soutin's a Belarusian, Jewish artist whose works are also incredible. But to focus on Laurencin's works, the collection is thought to be one of the best collections in the world of her works. She actually was Paris-born, met Apollinaire, her style, Guillaume Apollinaire, whose name you might know of. He was kind of a poet, very famous French poet, but really in the art world at the time. And really, after she meets him, she would actually befriend, people like Picasso, Picabia, Robert Delaunay, and so on. And so she was really considered amongst her peers as being a great artist amongst these guys, these top 20th century artists, modern artists. And she would then marry a German man and then get sent during World War I down to, she had to kind of escape France because she was immediately considered German. And she moves to Spain, which is where her art evolves a little bit more into this kind of what some art historians have kind of considered as being lipstick lesbian, or really hyper effeminate colors, like think fairy floss. and, these kind of pastel colors.
Hmm.
So what's interesting about that is that she was actually quite successful during her actual career. She was supported by the likes of, uh, Dominica Guillaume, who is the wife of Paul Guillaume, a very famous, reputable art dealer in Paris. And Dominica really kind of, pushed her art. Um, and so she was doing quite well. And then she even did a very famous portrait, which was caused quite a scandal between her and Coco Chanel.
Oh, interesting.
And what Coco Chanel would kind of denounce Laurent Saint, and Laurent Saint would denounce Coco Chanel as being a mere farm girl. But it was just this funny thing, because her career was, doing, quite well. And then, after she passed, again, she was kind of written out of the history books in a way. And I think if you wanted to consider why that is, there's certain reasons. Because she's got this hyper effeminate, she's got lots of her paintings feature women, kind of in tutus. She even actually worked for the ballet at a time. And she's got this beautiful abstract painterly application in the background, with certain Cubist references. But because it also features a lot of animals, not only these dancers, but also lots of animals, little doves and kind of fantastical horses and things like that. Because of that, and because, we're looking at an artist that's working around wartime, a lot of art historians and art critics became critical of her, posthumously, in the sense that, well, she's just kind of a little bit too effeminate. And what about abstract expressionism and modernism and, wartime reactions and conceptualism? And so her work was considered just decorative. And when I think about it, it's really quite funny, because you look at one of the most famous works in the world, which is Monet's Les Grandes Décorations, like his big decorations of the water lily pond, that he installed at the Orangerie in the same space that her works are on display. And one of the criticisms of his works is also that they were too decorative.
Hmm.
And I could go on and alter the path of this podcast in terms of my defense of Monet's works, but to keep it kind of more towards Laurent Saint's works, I just find it funny that despite that, that criticism of his works, that initial criticism of those beautiful water lilies, that Laurent Saint's career or reputation didn't bounce back quite as much as his. And that is maybe a question of curation, maybe of exposure again, maybe of the fact that, a lot of people that I show her works to, they simply just don't know who she is. And so there can't be a debate after all. People just simply don't know about her. So I think it's really a multitude of reasons that women artists are still being overlooked today.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I wonder if people hadn't known she was a woman, if they'd just considered her works on their own, if they would have been able to accept them the way they do Monet's water lilies, or even Degas painted dancers and
I know.
ballerinas in
I know.
tutus. So
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to do that comparison between Degas and Laurent Saint. Suddenly, Degas was attempting, in my opinion, to do different things. I think he was like a compositional genius. However, in terms of that, that pretty, that decoration, that those pastel colors, you could very much compare the two artists and wonder why it is that Degas has, relatively, well, Degas struggled, as well as an impressionist artist, but why is it that Laurent Saint was written out?
and Degas is and he was selected for the canon, right? And he got to live on, and she
That's it.
didn't. Yeah,
Precisely.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple of other French artists, and I also want to make sure that you get back to Artemisia Gentileschi. Yeah,
Gentileschi.
she's one of the ones that I did learn about, not until graduate school, but one of the women artists, one of my friends did a presentation on her, so I was quite fascinated. But yes, there are a couple more women artists that I'd love to hear you talk about.
So, well, I mean, I would want to touch on briefly my grandmother's career.
Yes, please do.
Just again going back to, so her name was Joy Peck. She was actually, quite a well-known artist. She received a lot of press at the time, even though some of that press, even just recently looking over the art criticisms of my grandmother's works, that again, she has this naive touch, but is it too fantastical? Is, too whimsical is one of those criticisms.
Hmm.
And just to briefly comment on her life, she was very forward thinking, very much, respected again among her peers. And once again, her career, and arguably that's even my family's fault, because now I'm trying to make an attempt to catalog all of her works, that we still have in our family estate, and to maybe put on a show. It's kind of very ongoing, but just to kind of bring back the discussion and around her works, which are absolutely stunning. And then you look at her contemporaries, and male contemporaries specifically, who are still the most reputable names in Australia, of that period of modern art. So even just to touch on that, is quite interesting. But who else did I have? Oh,
You,
Lebrun.
yes, yes.
So Vigée Lebrun, Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, was an artist working in and around the period of Marie Antoinette. And so she would actually catch the eye of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. And, as a female portraiture artist, she she had this way about her of capturing something that perhaps Marie Antoinette had never received from a male artist, which was maybe a sense of understanding, or a more delicate touch in the sense of understanding what it is to be a woman.
Mhm.
And so, Marie Antoinette is often, in my opinion, she's the scapegoat of the French Revolution. The poor thing. Not to declare that she was completely innocent. However, from the age of 14, she was married into this French royal family. She was immediately called l'Autrichienne, which is the
Mm.
Austrian bitch.
Mm.
Literally from day one. And so, even that saying that, she said, let them eat cake, that's complete propaganda against her. And so I feel like it's important to touch on Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun's career, because indeed, but you could argue that perhaps she wouldn't have had, again, a successful career had she not caught the eye of the Queen.
Mm.
And in fact, it was a discussion between the two that Vigée Lebrun would paint a series of portraits of the Queen in less formal attire. And so when these were released, they were considered highly inappropriate. And yet it enables us to see a different viewpoint of somebody that was often perceived as being excessive, as being decadent, naive, and so on. And yet, I think about one of the portraits that I love by Vigée Lebrun, which happens to be Marie Antoinette in a beautiful little blue gown, clipping a rose,
Mhm.
and in a garden setting. So this was very, contemporary audience members really don't realize just how atypical that was for the time, how almost unacceptable it was, because for the Queen, you would only ever see her in, a room with a crown next to her, in a beautiful gown, like elaborate gown, uh, embroidered gown and so on, rather than what was considered a very, kind of, yes, less formal attire.
Mhm.
And so the fact that Vigée Lebrun had you know, uh, the understanding to maybe see beyond the expectations of the Queen, and also see beyond the mispresumptions of the Queen, was really quite something. And so I think that's where the two formed a bond, because perhaps
Mm.
Marie Antoinette felt more like a human being rather than this kind of expectation as being queen.
Mhm.
So, I mean, luckily for Lebrun, despite a bit of scandal, and her name became quite reputable, simply because of that connection, of course, being the Queen's first chosen painter. But that meant that it was quite dangerous, because towards the Revolution, she had to make the decision to, escape France, and would spend, the rest of her career kind of traveling around Europe, avoiding until, of course, the completion of the first revolution. But she very much traveled around entirely. And so again, I mean, the same thing can be said for her career. Very successful during her life, actually. But once again, I've only really seen her name, and again, maybe this is just my readings, but I've only seen her name kind of pop up in conversation over the past maybe 20 years.
If you're not hearing her or seeing her, then no one is.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's somebody out there, but yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that is fascinating. That's that's beautiful. Like her humanization of the queen and making her relatable as a woman, not just, not as a scapegoat. That's so
completely
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, who's next on our
list? So I love Gentileschi. I love many different, I love a lot of the artists that I've actually discussed. But Gentileschi, I just adore her. I think, first of all, I mean, her story is, you probably know her story already. Basically, she's a very, very talented painter. In my opinion, supersedes her father. So Orazio Gentileschi was her father, working alongside with Caravaggio, so around, Baroque Italy period, early 1600s. And of course, or not of course, but atypically, Orazio would train his daughter, Artemisia. So Gentileschi. So this, I'm kind of excited to talk about it, because for two reasons. One, because I love her style, I love her name, and I'm really happy that, in fact, at least in universities, I feel like her name is being shown off a little bit more than it once was. And two, because of actually a personal story that I have with a recent Artemisia Gentileschi fascination I've developed over the past few years. So essentially, Gentileschi, her chiaroscuro, I think, so I'm a big fan of Caravaggio. And so I think actually her chiaroscuro, which is that contrast between dark and light, I think is just divine. I think her work really, in terms of the art market, actually should be kind of on par with the art market of Caravaggio. And I think that's slowly changing over the years. So her personal story is actually, unfortunately, a very sad one, which is that through her father's connections, there was actually another artist, Tassi, who would unfortunately rape Artemisia Gentileschi. And so, I believe she was in her early teens when this occurred. And so despite her not wanting to go forward with, claims against Tassi, her father, with his daughter's, with his daughter's pride, not pride.
Like her honor?
Her honor, thank you. With her honor having been taken, he really kind of pushed his daughter to go forward with accusations of rape. Now, unfortunately, at the time, this meant that, if you were to accuse somebody of rape, you too would undergo, grueling interrogation, torture, and so on, just really determining whether it's true or not. And so, you can really see, what a tragic youth she endured, and how difficult it would have been, and even though it is recounted that she was very, very stoic in a way in her, testimonial and so on. But yeah, a very difficult situation. One can only imagine. One hopes not to imagine. So, so basically, it would make sense then that you can see this youth, or this experience in her early years, coming out a little bit in her paintings. So, she would become actually very well known for, the Judith and Holofernes story, which is, essentially Judith slaying the head of Holofernes. Now, this is not the first time this has ever been depicted. And Caravaggio has done a beautiful, and again, I say this not in terms of the subject matter, but a beautiful depiction of this slaying. And yet within the Caravaggio work, like it's less about the woman's partaking in the slaying of the head or the execution, essentially. And it's more about, the Holofernes kind of grotesque. And then you look at, there's actually several of these works by Gentileschi. In fact, she would actually execute at least two that we know of paintings of this depiction. One is of Judith in a blue dress. The other is Judith in a yellow dress. And who is Judith and who is Holofernes? Well, it's a very famous text which basically depicts or shows this idea of Judith protecting, in order to protect her village that is under Assyrian attack. She enters Holofernes' tent, who is the leader of the Assyrian army. And, under the kind of guise of seduction, she will allow for him to become drunk. And then whilst drunk, she beheads Holofernes. So the idea is, protecting, she's sacrificing, or, doing the unthinkable in order to protect her family, her village people, and so on. So yes, so it's basically a story that has been reiterated, during the Renaissance, during the Baroque periods. It's not an uncommon subject matter, in fact. And so Caravaggio, would do at least one as well, a depiction of the same story. However, Caravaggio's version is, a little bit less about the female perspective, and more about the grotesque of the Holofernes' actual head being beheaded. Whereas Artemisia, the beauty of Artemisia's versions, and I must admit, they're actually a little bit more grotesque in the sense of the blood splatter. I believe the one at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the blood splatter onto Gentileschi's breasts, and not in a sexual way, but onto her décolletage, let's say, is much more intense, and you really get this, whoa, this is an intense moment. But you see it as well, not only the savagery, unfortunately, of his head, but you also see it in the sense of her experience, as well as the servant's experience in assisting her with, again, a horrible act, so. But what's interesting is actually a recent experience, personal experience, which is that I actually went to a show that's a small retrospective at the Jacquemin-André Museum here in Paris with a friend. And the friend, it was just interesting to look at male observations, so men's observations within the room and women's. And, there were a lot of women that were kind of looking up close. And in fact, the friend that I happened to be with, a guy, ended up meeting me at the end of the exhibition. And I was like, "Did you enjoy the show?" And he responded, "Yes, I did. However, I wonder whether audience members would be so, compelled to see the Judith and Holofernes, slaying of scene if it were reversed."
Oh, wow.
And I was like, well, I think so, because this isn't the first time that we've seen something, a violent occurrence towards a man. And nor is it the first time that we've seen audience members have reacted to something towards a woman. But it was a very strange, interesting, because it is important to think about, differing opinions towards her works. But I couldn't help but feel as though it was more about, perhaps it was read in a different way. I think that, and maybe even my wrongdoing, which was that I hadn't mentioned that, Caravaggio has done this exact same scene quite a few times, as well as many other Baroque artists. Baroque was very much about the drama and the theater. So it makes sense that this is a theme that would be attacked by multiple different artists, including, one that I know of, female artist, amongst many other male artists. But it was just interesting to see that reaction about the female artist, and I wonder whether it so the question could be inverted, and I could say, well, would you be so offended if this was painted by a male artist? And it's just an interesting idea. I don't know where I stand with it, and I totally understand and acknowledge my friend's response as well. But I just think it's an interesting thing to just point out.
Yeah, very interesting. Oh, I love hearing all of these. I mean, these stories about these remarkable women and their art is incredible. And I'll just tell listeners who are listening on the podcast, if you want to go to YouTube, we'll have images there. And on our website also, and on Instagram, we'll put some images up there too so that you can actually see the paintings that Sunday's talking about. But thanks for telling us about all these remarkable women. I'm wondering now if we can kind of fast forward along the timeline and have you tell us about just one or two contemporary female artists, just because I'm curious if contemporary female artists are being recognized now.
So I think that is the case. I think ever so slightly in the 21st century, we've seen an increase in representation of female artists. I think it's really changing now, specifically with a young female artists in their 20s and 30s and maybe 40s. It's just really quite interesting just to consider that, just like a quick note on the 20th century female artists versus their male counterparts. One of the most popular artists, or certainly the most successful on the art market, has been Yayoi Kusama, a Japanese artist who focuses on dots. One of the reasons she's been most commercially successful is because of her, associations with Fondation Louis Vuitton as a brand. So her integration of artwork within clothing and branding and so on. But then you look at some of her male counterparts, and whilst Kusama, just to like briefly touch, I don't want it to become an art market statistics thing. So if not at all that they're the same artist, but both born around the same period of time. So 1929 is Kusama, and David Hockney, who's having a major retrospective here at the Fondation Louis Vuitton. Also, I love his work. He's born in 1937. So you compare her works around 80 million to his 90 million. And even just to give you more of a sense of that perspective, 13% of total global auction value is dedicated to female artists,
Oh,
even
wow.
in 2023. And so, as an example, typically you'll see female artists breaking maybe like 16, 20, 30 million kind of max. There's always an exception, of course. But then you look at male counterpart artists and they're breaking like 150 million,
Wow.
So again, there's a great disparity. And I don't think it's because there's a lack of talent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Wow.
And so for contemporary artists, I have like a little list. There's some wonderful contemporary artists. One thing that's great is Marlène Dumas, another French artist. Her one of her works literally last week sold at auction for, I think it was like 13.5 million, maybe euros. And so that again was record breaking for a living female artist. So that's great. She's suddenly kind of on the way up. There's also artists, such as Jenny Saville, all of those kind of famous names, Cecily Brown, another great example of kind of a contemporary 20th century and 21st century artist. And then you've got some of those young up and comers, which I really like to see. So people like Flora Yuknovich, Sarah Shea. I'm terrible with the pronunciation, but it's Szee. As well as Shabalala Self, whose works are really wonderful depictions of, African American woman's, life, but done in this beautiful pictorial sense with kind of references to her upbringing in Harlem, in the background, and really beautiful self-portraits as well. Flora Yuknovich's works are, kind of commenting on, which I find really interesting. They're using a certain color palette that dates back to the Rococo. And what did the Rococo associate with? Feminine colors such as pastels, as well as with Marie Antoinette. And yet she's kind of, she's kind of commenting on that art. It's an art historical kind of loop that's going on. And so I think it's really interesting to see that, yes, there is, I think, an evolving art market for female artists, but suddenly still nothing to where male artists are sitting at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thanks for mentioning all of those names. We'll have those in the show notes too, so people can
Hopefully
be reminded. Yeah,
hopefully I pronounce them correctly.
I'm sure that's better than I would have done. That's wonderful. Well, my last question for you is what listeners could do to improve this situation. What can we do to support women artists, to educate ourselves, and to keep this positive momentum going?
That's great. I guess you know what maybe comes down to. I think it's about a dialogue, creating a dialogue. So I'm really happy that we're creating a bit of a dialogue today, or continuing a dialogue today. Um, you know, maybe even Google searches. I think that there's those algorithms. The tech world is definitely not my thing, but if the more people search for a female artist, maybe the more they'll become more prominent.
Yeah.
If they're lucky enough to be art collectors, they could be trying to evolve their awareness of female artists and maybe collecting some of them. And yeah, I suppose that's a kind of a good start. I guess, yeah, listening to more podcasts on female artists is another example.
Fabulous. Yes. And again, I think it really did encourage me to hear throughout this conversation how things have changed and improved,
Yeah,
albeit incrementally and sometimes in small increments, that it does improve. And the more people talk about it, even people just teaching art classes in their communities, right? Choosing to focus on women artists, again, so that the next generation just grows up thinking of it as normal.
completely. Or even, if you have the opportunity to go up to somebody and say, where are the Morisot's? And just to backtrack briefly is what I find it's really interesting with dialogue around female artists is that we often tend to call them by their first and last names. Isn't that
Mm,
interesting? And so yeah, sometimes I'm like, do I want to correct myself, or do I still want to say Bertha Morisot or Bertha Morisot or Marie Lançon? Just does it actually point out that it's a female artist, and does that matter?
wow.
It's just interesting that even dialogue surrounding female artists is entirely different.
You're right. I hadn't thought of that. That's true. To say someone just their last name conveys status, doesn't it?
Right,
Like,
right, yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Wow. I'm so glad you pointed that out. That's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
Huh. Well, Sunday Rennie, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for being here. I learned so much from you. And I'm wondering if you have any social media handles or anywhere that listeners can find your work.
Yes, for sure. So at present, I am offering private tours of museums and specializing in certain artists such as Monet, as well as doing certain highlights of female artists within museums. So anybody that's interested in contacting me can contact me via Savoir Tours. So that's SAVOIR Tours, TOURS.com. So voilà.
Fabulous. And again, I can't recommend the tours highly enough. My daughter Sophie is an art history major in college, and we had 2 fantastic days with Sunday in Paris last year, and we learned so much. So, yes, highly, highly recommended if you're in Paris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Sunday. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, for me too. I'm very happy to have exposed hopefully some new artists, some new names to people's repertoire.